The radio crackled, not with the clean, crisp sound of a secure transmission, but with the hiss and pop of a dying man's last breath. Static gnawed at the edges of the words, tearing them apart before they could even form. In the cold, sterile air of the command tent, miles from the jagged peaks of the Serpent's Maw, every soul leaned in, their own breathing suspended as if the oxygen in the room belonged to the voice on the other end. Trident actual to any friendly. Command, do you read? The voice was strained, breathless, a man running on fumes and sheer will. A map of the valley glowed on the main screen, a topographical nightmare of steep inclines and narrow passages. A place where tactics went to die. A single red icon, labeled Trident, blinked weakly in the heart of that labyrinth. Command reads you, Trident actual. Colonel Thorne's voice boomed, too loud, too confident for the situation. Report. Status, over. He stood with his hands on his hips, a bulldog of a man carved from regulations and ambition. He saw the map not as a place of flesh and blood, but as a chessboard where he was unfortunately losing a piece. The reply came in ragged bursts. Pinned. High ground. Everywhere. They knew we were coming. It's a kill box. A pause, filled with the distant, unmistakable chatter of enemy fire. We've fallen back to the riverbed. Ammo is black. Requesting immediate. No, disregard. Airspace is a meat grinder. Do not attempt extraction. I say again, do not attempt. The voice was swallowed by a deafening roar, a sound that made the speakers in the tent physically vibrate, followed by an agonizing silence. Then, one last whisper, so faint it was almost imaginary. Tell our families. The transmission died. The red icon for Trident stopped blinking. It went dark. A heavy, suffocating stillness fell over the tent. The analysts stared at their screens. The communications officers checked their equipment, but everyone knew. It was over. That was the goodbye call. The one you train for but pray you never hear. Colonel Thorne let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping just an inch. Damn it, he muttered, more out of frustration for a failed operation than for the 12 lives that had just been extinguished. He turned to the gathered officers. The window is closed. That valley is a fortress. Any pilot who enters it won't be coming back. We'll wait for nightfall, see if a drone can get a peek, but for now, we pull back our assets. He said, it with a grim finality, a doctor calling the time of death. Men nodded, their faces grim, accepting the harsh calculus of their profession. But in the back of the tent, leaning against a support pole, Major Ava Rostova didn't nod. She didn't move. Her flight suit was a shade darker than the others, worn from countless hours in the cockpit, not a conference room. Her call sign, Valkyrie, was stitched above her heart, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and apprehension. By those who had flown with her. She was quiet, an observer by nature, her stillness often mistaken for indifference. They were wrong. Her mind was a whirlwind, replaying the topographical data of the Serpent's Maw, a place she'd studied, flown over in simulations, a place she knew better than anyone. She saw the wind patterns, the thermal updrafts, the blind spots in the enemy's likely firing arcs. She saw a path. A razor-thin, insane, impossible path. But it was there. She pushed off the pole and stepped forward, her boots making no sound on the tent's floor. Sir, she said, her voice calm but cutting through the defeated silence like a razor. There's a way in. Every eye turned. To her. Colonel Thorne's gaze was particularly sharp, laced with an old, familiar irritation. He had never liked her. She wasn't one of his boys. She didn't play the political games, didn't laugh at his stale jokes in the offices' club. She just flew. And she flew in a way that made men like him uncomfortable, a way that seemed to bend the rules of physics and protocol alike. Major Rostova, he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. Did you not just hear the team leader himself? The sky is lethal. Even our top-of-the-line drones can't navigate the signal interference and the crosswinds in that gorge, let alone a 100,000-pound aircraft. They can't if they fly over it, sir, Ava replied, her eyes locked on his. But you don't have to fly over it. The southern wall of the canyon creates a sustained thermal updraft just before dusk. It's a river of air. If you ride that current, you can stay below the ridge line. You can fly under their radar, under their guns. A scoff came from one of the drone operators. She wants to fly an A-10 Warthog like a paper airplane, he muttered to his neighbor. Thorne's lip curled into a condescending smirk. He'd Been waiting for an opportunity to put her in her place for months. Major, your creative thinking is noted. But this is the real world, not a flight simulator where you can just hit reset. We are not sacrificing a $40 million asset and its pilot on a hunch based on some meteorological fairy tale. He turned his back to her, a clear dismissal. The mission is scrubbed. That's an order. He looked around the room. Is that clear? A chorus of yes, sir, filled the tent. But Ava didn't speak. She just stood there, the dismissal washing over her not with shame, but with a cold, clarifying anger. It wasn't just about the 12 men in that valley. It was about this constant, grinding condescension. The assumption that her calculations were just hunches, that her instincts were just feelings. He wasn't just scrubbing a mission, he was erasing her, telling her that her expertise, her very reason for being here, was irrelevant. The fire that had been smoldering inside her for years, banked by professionalism and discipline, finally found a draft. She turned and walked out of the tent without another word. The oppressive heat of the Afghan evening hit her like a physical blow. The air smelled of sand, diesel, and something metallic and distant. She walked past the rows of humming generators and prefabricated barracks, her destination clear in her mind. She didn't question what she was about to do. The debate was over. Thorne had made his decision. Now, she would make hers. As she neared Hangar 4, the cavernous home of the A-10 squadron, a grizzled figure emerged from the shadows. Master Sergeant Frank Sarge Kowalski, her crew chief. He was a man with hydraulic fluid in his veins and more hours on a flight line than she had in the air. He held a greasy rag in one hand and looked at her, his weathered face impassive. He'd seen her walk out of the command tent. He didn't need to ask what happened. They're leaving them out there, aren't they? He said. It wasn't a question. Ava just nodded, her jaw tight. Thorne says it's impossible. Sarge spat on the ground. He looked at the sky, where the sun was beginning to bleed into a bruised purple, painting the underside of the clouds. Impossible is just a word people use when they're afraid to try. He looked back at her, his eyes searching hers, seeing the storm brewing there. He'd seen that look before, right before she did something that would end up in a debriefing. 4 weeks. The hog is fueled and ready. Pre-flight checks were done an hour ago. Just on a hunch. A flicker of a smile touched Ava's lips, the first crack in her icy composure. She knew her crew. They were loyal to the pilot, not the politics. What about the ordnance? Sarge's grin was grim. Let's just say we loaded her up for a parade. A very, very loud parade. Full complement of 30mm rockets. A couple of Mavericks, just in case. He paused, his voice dropping. Ava, if you do this, there's no coming back. Not for your career. Thorne will have you in front of a firing squad. They're not gone yet, Sarge, she said softly, looking towards the distant mountains that held the Serpent's Maw. As long as they're breathing, they have a chance. And their chance is sitting in that hangar. She met his gaze, and in that moment, an unspoken pact was sealed. An act of rebellion, of loyalty, of faith. Get her ready. Sarge nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. She's always ready. For you, Major. He turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the hangar. Ava took one last deep breath of the desert air. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The anger was gone, replaced by an absolute, diamond-hard certainty. Thorne thought she was emotional. He had no idea. Emotion was a fog. This was clarity. This was purpose. She walked towards the hangar, the sounds of her own footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet of the evening. She was no longer Major Rostova, a subordinate in a chain of command. She was Valkyrie, and she was going to decide who lived and who died today. Inside the hangar, under the dim work lights, the A-10 sat waiting. It wasn't a sleek, beautiful machine like a fighter jet. It was brutal, ugly, and magnificent. A flying tank built around a cannon the size of a small car. Sarge and 2 other trusted crew members were moving with a quiet, efficient urgency, pulling chocks, running final systems checks. No words were needed. They were all in this together. Ava climbed the ladder into the cockpit, the familiar scent of worn leather and electronics enveloping her like a second skin. She strapped herself in, her hands moving with practiced grace over the switches and controls. Flaps, trim, throttle. Each movement was a prayer, a piece of a ritual she had performed 1,000 times. She closed the canopy, and the world outside went silent, muted. It was just her and the beast. She put on her helmet, the hiss of the oxygen system a comforting sound. Through the cockpit glass, she saw Sarge give her a final thumbs up, his face a mask of worry and pride. She nodded back. With a flick of a switch, she began the engine. Startup sequence. The twin turbofan engines behind her began to whine, a low hum that grew into a piercing scream. The entire airframe vibrated, the machine waking from its slumber, hungry. The ground crew scattered as she pushed the throttle forward. The Warthog lurched, then began to roll, its heavy frame moving slowly at first, then gaining momentum. She taxied out of the hangar and onto the secondary runway, the one used for emergencies, the one that wasn't visible from the command tower. Every light on her console glowed green. The bird was ready. She was ready. She didn't radio the tower. For clearance. She didn't check in with command. She was a ghost, an unsanctioned weapon moving under the cover of dusk. She lined up on the runway, the long strip of asphalt stretching out into the twilight. In the distance, the first stars were beginning to appear. She thought of those 12 men, huddled in a dry riverbed, counting their last bullets, their last breaths. She thought of Colonel Thorne, sitting in his comfortable chair, smug in his certainty that the day's work was done. He was wrong. The work was just beginning. She pushed the throttles to the firewall. The engines roared to their full, deafening power, pressing her back into her seat. The A-10 surged forward, a behemoth of armor and firepower clawing its way. Into the air. As the wheels left the ground, a voice suddenly erupted in her helmet, crackling with fury. It was Thorne. Someone must have seen her. Major Rostova, what in God's name do you think you're doing? You are flying in direct violation of a command order. I am ordering you to stand down. Return to base immediately. Ava didn't respond. She just kept climbing, angling the nose of her warplane towards the dark, waiting mountains. She was already a mile away from the base, a phantom silhouette against the dying sun. Thorne's voice was still screaming in her ear, a torrent of threats about court-martials, dishonorable discharges, federal prison. But his voice was already starting to sound small, distant, insignificant. Because as she flew towards the Serpent's Maw, she wasn't just flying away from her base. She was flying away from her career, her past, and every rule that had ever held her back. She was flying into the storm. But what she didn't know was that the storm waiting for her inside that canyon was far deadlier than she could ever imagine. And the enemy wasn't the only thing that would be hunting her in the dark. Colonel Thorne's voice was a hornet's nest buzzing in her helmet. Rostova, your career is over. You will be stripped of your rank and prosecuted to the fullest extent of military law. Do you hear me? Land that aircraft now. Ava reached up and calmly adjusted the volume on her comms panel, turning his tirade down to a faint, impotent buzz. She had already crossed the Rubicon. His threats were just noise now, the meaningless chatter of a world she had already left behind. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her cockpit, to the green glow of her heads-up display, and the jagged line of the mountains on the horizon. The flight to the Serpent's Maw was a race against the fading light. The sun had sunk below the horizon, and the sky was a deep, bruised indigo. The valley below was a river of shadows, the landscape losing its definition, melting into a murky, featureless expanse. This was the most dangerous time to fly, the dead man's hour. Between day and night, when the human eye and the night vision systems fought for dominance, and neither one truly worked. For Ava, it was perfect. If she was having trouble seeing, so were they. She kept the A-10 low, 100 feet above the rocky plains, a ghost skimming the surface of the earth. The Warthog was not built for speed, but for tenacity. It flew slow. It hit hard, and it could take a beating that would shred any other aircraft. It was an extension of her own personality, stubborn, resilient, and underestimated. As she flew, a memory surfaced, unbidden. Her father, a crop duster from rural Nebraska, standing in a field of wheat. She was 12 years old, and she had just crashed her bicycle, scraping her knee bloody. She was crying, more from embarrassment than pain. He hadn't coddled her. He had knelt down, wiped the dirt from her face with his callous thumb, and said, Ava, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who see a wall and turn back, and those who see a wall and start looking for a way over, under, or straight through. Don't you ever be the first kind. That lesson had become the bedrock of her existence. Thorne saw a wall. She was looking for a way through. Suddenly, a new alarm blared in the cockpit, a shrill, insistent beep. A weather warning. A massive, unexpected storm cell was rolling in from the north, a black wall of turbulence and rain moving with unnatural speed. It wasn't on any of the earlier forecasts. It was a freak of mountain weather, unpredictable and violent. Her radar screen lit up with a solid wall of red. Flying over it was impossible. It would tear her wings off. Flying around it would take too much time the men in the valley didn't have. That left only one option. The one her father had taught her. Straight through or, in this case, under. She pushed the stick forward, diving even lower, into the narrow, winding valleys that snake their way toward the main canyon. This was nap of the earth flying, a dangerous dance with the ground where a single miscalculation meant a fiery death. The terrain-following radar was her only guide, painting a green, ghostly image of the world ahead on her display. The plane bucked and shuddered as the leading edge of the storm hit, the wind shear grabbing her wings like giant, invisible hands. Rain hammered against the canopy, thick and blinding. It felt less like flying and more like being in a submarine, navigating a rocky seabed in a hurricane. The comms link to the base, already weak, finally died, swallowed by the storm's electromagnetic interference. Thorne's angry buzzing was gone. She was completely, utterly alone. No eyes on her, no backup, no one to call if things went wrong. A flicker of fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her focus. It was the fear of isolation, of dying anonymously in a forgotten corner of the world. She pushed it down, converting it into fuel. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, the feel of the stick in her hand, the groaning protest of the airframe as she wrestled it through the turbulent air. After 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, she broke through the other side of the storm cell. The rain stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The air grew still. And there it was, the entrance to the Serpent's Maw. It was even more imposing up close, a monstrous crack in the earth, the cliffs rising up like colossal, broken teeth. The last vestiges of twilight cast an eerie, spectral glow on the rock faces, making them look like the bones of some ancient leviathan. There was no sign of life, no movement, just an overwhelming sense of malevolent silence. It felt like a tomb. She took a deep, steadying breath and angled the warthog toward the canyon mouth. This was the moment of truth. Her theory about the thermal updraft, the river of air that would be her invisible road, was about to be tested. She throttled back, letting the plane's momentum carry her forward. She needed to enter low and slow, dipping below the enemy's line of sight before they could ever get a lock on her. Her altimeter read 200 feet, then 150. She was skimming the tops of the sparse, twisted trees that clung to the canyon floor. As she crossed the invisible threshold into the canyon proper, she felt it. A subtle but powerful lift. The plane seemed to become weightless for a second, rising on a cushion of warm, upward-moving air. It was the thermal. It was real. A surge of triumph shot through her. She had been right. She could use this. She could ride this current deep into the heart of the enemy's lair without them ever knowing she was there. She let a small, tight smile grace her lips. Her plan was to hug the southern wall, using its shadow and the thermal lift as cover, until she reached the coordinates of the SEAL's last known position. She would be a whisper in the wind, a phantom they would never see coming. She settled the plane into the groove of the air current, the controls feeling light and responsive in her hands. The canyon walls drifted past, close enough that she could make out individual cracks and fissures in the rock. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of her engines. It was working. It was actually working, but the mountain had other plans. As she rounded the first major bend in the canyon, a proximity alarm shrieked. A flock of birds, startled from their nests on the cliff face, erupted into the air directly in front of her. She banked hard to the right, instinct taking over. Her right wingtip, for a fraction of a second, was less than 10 feet from solid rock. The maneuver was violent, throwing her against her straps. The warthog groaned in protest, the stress on the airframe immense. She corrected, bringing the plane back to level, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was in that moment, as her eyes darted back to her instrument panel to check for damage, that she saw it. Her primary targeting display, The screen that would allow her to lock onto and destroy enemy positions flickered once, twice, and then it went black. A single, ominous message appeared in stark red letters. SYS fault, EGI nav fail. Her primary navigation and weapons targeting computer had just died. A cold dread, far worse than the fear she'd felt in the storm, washed over her. She was deep inside the most dangerous piece of sky on the planet, flying an aircraft that was now half blind. She could still fly, she could still fire her cannon, but she would have to do it manually. No targeting assistance, no range finding, no computer-aided precision. She would have to aim a 40-ton jet and its 7-barrel cannon by eye, like a gunman from the Old West. The thermal updraft, her secret weapon, suddenly felt like a trap. It was carrying her deeper and deeper into a place from which she might not have the ability to fight her way out. She could turn back. No one would blame her. An equipment failure of this magnitude was a mission killer. Thorne would probably even forgive her insubordination if she returned now, tail between her legs. She could save herself, but then, through the low hum of her engines, she heard a new sound. Faint, at first, then growing louder. It was the rhythmic, deadly sound of heavy machine gun fire echoing off the canyon walls from somewhere up ahead. It was followed by the sharp crack of sniper rifles. The SEALs. They were still alive. And they were still fighting. Her decision was made in that instant. There was no turning back. Not now. Not ever. She pushed the throttle forward, accelerating. Down the river of air, her eyes scanning the dark canyon ahead. She was flying blind, her most advanced systems useless, but she didn't care. They could take her tech. They could take her career. They couldn't take her will. She would become the targeting computer. She would become the eyes of the storm. But as she flew deeper into the moor, she failed to notice a small, intermittent flicker on a secondary sensor screen, a faint energy signature that didn't belong to any known infantry weapon. Something else was in the valley with her, something advanced, and it was already listening to the sound of her engines. Flying without her targeting computer felt like trying to perform surgery with a blindfold on. The A-10 Warthog was a precision instrument, but that precision was a partnership between pilot and machine. Now, half of that partnership was gone. Ava was on her own, relying on a skill set that technology had rendered almost obsolete. Pure, unadulterated stick and rudder flying. She was no longer a systems operator. She was a barnstormer from a bygone era, her senses stretched to their breaking point. The canyon twisted and turned, a relentless serpent of rock and shadow. Every bend presented a new challenge, a new gust of wind that threatened to slam her into a wall. She kept her eyes peeled, scanning the darkness for any sign of the SEALs or the enemy. The gunfire she'd heard earlier had grown more intense, a symphony of destruction echoing through the gorge. She was close. She could feel it. Her knuckles were white on the control stick, but her hands were steady. Then she saw it. A flicker of light on the canyon floor ahead. Not the bright, chaotic flash of a muzzle blast, but a tiny, rhythmic blink. An infrared strobe, barely visible to the naked eye, designed to be seen only by friendly forces with night vision. It was a signal. It was them. They were marking their position. She keyed her MIC, broadcasting on the SEAL's emergency frequency. Trident team, this is Valkyrie on station. I see your mark. Talk to me. The voice that came back was weak, distorted by the canyon's terrible acoustics, but it was laced with disbelief and a desperate surge of hope. Valkyrie, are you an angel? We thought we were ghosts. Not yet, Trident Actual, Ava said, her own voice a low, reassuring rumble. Where's the party? Everywhere. They're dug in on both ridges, hammering us from above. We are in the dry riverbed, but they're pushing us east, into a narrow pass. It feels like they're herding us. Herding. Them. The word sent a chill down Ava's spine. This wasn't a simple ambush. It was a calculated trap. They weren't just trying to eliminate the SEALs, they were forcing them into a pre-selected kill zone. Her mission had just changed. This wasn't just about providing cover, it was about breaking the trap before it could be sprung. I see them, she said, her eyes tracing the faint heat signatures now visible on the cliffs. Hold tight. I'm going to make some noise. She pulled the Warthog up slightly, just enough to clear a rocky outcrop, then nosed down into her first attack run. This was where the lack of a targeting computer became terrifyingly real. She had no computer to calculate the drop of the bullets, no guidance system to lock onto the targets. It was all on her. Her brain became a supercomputer, calculating airspeed, angle of attack, distance, and windage in a fraction of a second. She lined up the biggest cluster of enemy fighters on the northern ridge, placed her targeting pipper just ahead of them, and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon erupted with a sound that defied description. It wasn't a series of shots. It was a solid, visceral roar, like the sky itself was being torn in half. The entire aircraft shuddered around her as it spat out 30mm depleted uranium shells at a rate of 70 per second. A stream of white-hot tracers lit up the night, a lance of pure destruction that slammed into the ridge. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Rock, sandbags, and bodies were vaporized. The enemy position simply ceased to exist. A cheer erupted over the radio from the SEALs below. Hell yeah, Valkyrie. Get some. The elation was short-lived. As she pulled out of her dive, the enemy on the southern ridge opened up. Tracers stitched the air around her, a web of angry red lights. Most were wild, fired in panic, but some were dangerously close. A heavy machine gun, positioned perfectly to cover the canyon, began to hammer away at her. She could hear the distinct thump-thump-thump of rounds impacting her fuselage. The Warthog was built to take this kind of punishment, but even its legendary armor had limits. She banked hard, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat, and came around for another pass, this time on the southern ridge. She ignored the stream of bullets, her focus absolute. She lined up the shot, her finger hovering over the trigger. But just as she was about to fire, a new warning tone screamed in her headset. It was a sound she had only ever heard in the most advanced training simulators, a high-pitched, warbling squeal that signified one thing: a sophisticated radar lock. Her eyes darted to her threat receiver display. A symbol she didn't recognize was flashing urgently. It wasn't the simple icon for a shoulder-fired missile, a manpad's. This was different. This was a radar-guided system, mobile, fast, and deadly. Intel had sworn there were no weapons of this caliber in the entire region. Intel was wrong. Her blood ran cold. This was the centerpiece of the trap. The SEALs were the bait. She was the target. They had known, or at least suspected, that some form of air support might try to intervene. They had set up a trap within a trap, and she had flown right into it. The enemy fighters on the ridges were just a distraction, meant to draw her in, to make her predictable. While she was playing whack-a-mole with them, the real threat was preparing to swat her out of the sky. Valkyrie, what's your status? Trident Tactual's voice was tense. We are seeing something on the east end of the canyon. Some kind of vehicle. Before Ava could respond, a flash of brilliant white light erupted from the mouth of the box canyon the SEALs were being herded towards. Her threat receiver went from a warning squeal to a solid, deafening tone. The lock was absolute. On her panel, a single, terrifying word flashed in red. Missile launch. The world seemed to slow down. She saw the streak of smoke and fire hurtling. Towards her, an angel of death climbing at impossible speed. Her automated countermeasure systems, thrown into chaos by her earlier equipment failure, failed to deploy. It was all manual. All her. She slammed the stick to the left and hit the emergency flare and chaff dispenser, praying the system would respond. A shower of incandescent magnesium flares and radar-fooling aluminum strips erupted from the back of her aircraft. She wrenched the Warthog into a gut-twisting dive, pulling so many GS that her vision started to tunnel. The missile, a marvel of modern engineering, was not easily fooled. It adjusted its course, still tracking her, still coming. It was faster than her, smarter than her flares. She was out of options, out of altitude, out of time. The missile closed the distance in a heartbeat. She could see the flame from its rocket motor, a burning eye in the darkness. This was it. This was how it ended. A career of defying the odds, a lifetime of proving them wrong, all of it culminating in a fireball against a forgotten canyon wall. She braced for the impact, a strange sense of resignation washing over her. But what she hadn't counted on, what the enemy's advanced system hadn't programmed for, was the sheer, stubborn, physics-defying ugliness of her aircraft. The A-10 wasn't just armored, it was redundant. Its systems were separated, its engines mounted high and wide. It was designed to have pieces blown off it and keep flying. The missile, programmed to aim for the center of the heat signature from her engines, slammed into the space between them. The explosion was catastrophic. The world outside her canopy vanished in a flash of white-hot light and concussive force. Her aircraft was thrown sideways, tumbling through the air like a stone. Alarms screamed, warning lights flashed, the cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning electronics. The right engine was gone, sheared clean off. The left was sputtering, choking on its own smoke. Her tail was shredded, her hydraulics hemorrhaging fluid. She was no longer flying. She was falling, the ground rushed up to meet her, a dark, unforgiving promise of oblivion. The trap had sprung. The beast was wounded, falling from the sky. Down below, the enemy fighters who had witnessed the direct hit let out a triumphant cheer, their victory assured. But they had made the same mistake Colonel Thorne had made. They had underestimated the pilot. They thought the fight was over. They didn't realize that for Valkyrie, it had only just begun. The A-10 was a wounded animal, plummeting towards the canyon floor in a death spiral. Ava fought against the crushing G-forces, her arms straining as she hauled back on the control stick. The plane wasn't responding. The hydraulic lines, severed by the missile blast, were useless. The control surfaces were locked in place. She was a passenger in a 40-ton coffin. Pull up. Pull up. A computerized voice screamed from the dash, a useless, robotic plea through the graying edges of her vision. She saw the riverbed rushing towards her. This was it. But then, a flicker of memory from a grizzled instructor at flight school years ago surfaced in her mind. If everything electric and hydraulic goes to hell, Rostova, you have one last prayer. It's called manual reversion. The hog has backup cables, pure steel and muscle. It's like trying to steer a freight train with a piece of string, but it's all you've got. With a surge of adrenaline, she reached down and slammed a large, red lever labeled manual flight control. It took all her strength to move it. With a deafening clang, the backup systems engaged. The control stick suddenly felt like it was set in concrete, but it moved. A fraction of an inch, but it moved. She put both hands on it, her feet braced against the rudder pedals, and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed. The plane groaned, the tortured screech of metal on metal echoing through the cockpit. The spiral slowed. The nose, which had been pointed straight at the ground, began to lift, agonizingly slowly. She was pulling out of the dive, but she was still losing altitude fast. The treetops were just feet below her undercarriage. There. Branches scraping against the belly of the plane with a terrifying sound like giant fingernails on a chalkboard. She leveled out less than 50 feet from the ground, the crippled warthog staggering through the air, its one remaining engine coughing and sputtering, fighting to keep them airborne. She was alive. Flying, if you could call it that. She was. A breath away from stalling, a whisper away from becoming a crater. But she was alive, Valkyrie. My God, we saw the hit. We thought you were gone. Trident Actual's voice crackled in her ear, a mix of horror and astonishment. Still here, Ava grunted, her voice tight with effort. Every muscle in her body was screaming in protest as she fought to keep the plane stable. That missile came from the East Pass. It's a mobile anti-air unit. They were trying to draw me in. We see it, Valkyrie. It's rolling forward, out into the open. It's blocking our only way out. Ava looked ahead. The box canyon the SEALs were being herded towards was now guarded by the very weapon that had nearly killed her. It was a Tunguska, or something like it, a Russian-made anti-aircraft vehicle, a hybrid of radar-guided missiles and twin 30mm cannons. It was a fortress on treads, and it was sitting right where the extraction helicopters were supposed to land. The trap was now fully revealed. The SEALs were caught between the fighters on the ridges and a high-tech monster on the ground. A new voice, laced with static but dripping with fury, broke into the channel. It was Thorne. He must have gotten a comms link through a relay drone. Major Rostova, I saw that missile strike. Your aircraft is critically damaged. You will disengage immediately and attempt to return to base. That is a final and direct order. Acknowledge. Ava looked at the chaos unfolding below her. The SEALs were making their last stand, their backs to the wall. The extraction choppers, two massive Chinooks, were even now appearing over the western ridge, thundering towards this death trap, completely unaware of the Tunguska waiting for them. She had a choice. She could obey the order, save herself and what was left of her plane, and condemn every man down there to death. Or she could finish what she started. It wasn't a choice at all. Negative. Command, she said, her voice eerily calm. I'm not leaving them. You are throwing your life away, Major. Thorne screamed. You cannot win this fight. That weapon will tear you to pieces. Trident actual, Ava said, ignoring him completely. I'm going to take out that AA gun. I need you to give me a target. Valkyrie, it's dug in behind a rock shelf. We can't get a clean shot, and you can't hit it from your angle. He was right. From the air, the Tunguska was partially shielded by a thick granite overhang. A conventional bombing run was impossible. But she wasn't planning a conventional run. She was flying so low she was practically a ground vehicle herself. An idea, born of desperation and madness, began to form in her mind. A maneuver so outrageously dangerous it wasn't in any textbook, any training manual, any pilot's wildest nightmare. If she couldn't come at it from above, she would come at it from its own level. No, even lower, I'm not coming at it from above, she said, her voice a low whisper. She began to bank the crippled A-10, turning it back towards the mouth of the canyon. What are you doing? Trident Actual asked, his voice full of confusion. You're flying away from it. I'm getting a running start, she replied. She flew the wounded warthog down the length of the riverbed, her wheels almost skimming the dusty ground. The fighters on the ridges, who had assumed she was either dead or fleeing, were caught by surprise as she roared past them at less than 40 feet. They opened fire, but their shots went wild, unable to track her at this insane altitude and speed. She was using the canyon itself as a shield at the far end. She used the last of her failing hydraulic pressure and all of her physical strength to wrench the plane into a tight, screaming 180-degree turn. The airframe shrieked in protest, rivets popping from the strain. Now she was facing east again, looking down the barrel of the canyon. In the distance, she could see the Tunguska, and beyond it, the two approaching Chinooks, like slow, fat bumblebees. Flying into a spider's web, the Tunguska's turret began to swivel. Its radar had picked up the incoming helicopters. It was ignoring her, prioritizing the bigger, easier targets. That was her chance. Her only chance. Trident, light it up for me, she ordered. Use your laser designator. Paint the target. Give me a dot to aim at. Roger that, the SEAL leader replied. A moment later, a tiny, brilliant green dot, visible only through her helmet sensor suite, appeared on the rock face just above the Tunguska. They couldn't hit the vehicle itself, but they could show her exactly where it was. I see it, Ava said. She pushed the throttle of her one good engine to its maximum. The warthog surged forward, a charging, one-winged bull. Her plan was simple, and it was suicidal. She was going to fly down the canyon floor, under the enemy's guns, and fire her own cannon upwards into the weak underside of the rock shelf protecting the Tunguska. The ricochet and the concussive blast, she prayed, would be enough to disable it. But just as she began her attack run, the Tunguska's twin cannons swiveled back towards her. The crew inside had realized their mistake. They had recognized the greater, more immediate threat. The lead Chinook was only seconds from the landing zone, but the anti-aircraft gun was now pointing directly at her. The world narrowed to a tunnel. At the other end was the green laser dot. In between were the twin muzzles of the Tunguska's cannons, already starting to glow as they powered up. Thorne was still yelling in her ear, a meaningless distraction. The SEALs were holding their breath. The helicopter pilots were unaware of the drama unfolding below. It all came down to this. One pass. One shot. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The cannons of the Tunguska flashed. A storm of high-explosive shells screamed towards her. There was no time to evade, no room to maneuver. She was flying straight into the jaws of death. She held her course, her eyes locked on the green dot, her thumb pressing down on the trigger for one final, desperate act of defiance. The nose of her plane lit up as the GAU-8 began to spin, but the wall of incoming fire was already upon her, promising to tear her and her impossible plan to pieces before she could ever fire a single shot. Time seemed to stretch and distort, the seconds elongating into an eternity. The stream of 30mm shells from the Tunguska was a torrent of incandescent death, a solid wall of fire and steel coming straight at her. But in that stretched moment, Ava didn't see death. She saw geometry. She saw the trajectory of the enemy rounds, the slight upward angle of their cannons. And she saw her own position, skimming the very dust of the canyon floor. They were firing at her, but she was flying under their guns, the explosive shells. screamed just over her canopy, so close she could feel the heat and the percussive blast of their passage. The air buffeted her wounded plane violently, but the rounds passed harmlessly overhead. The Tunguska's crew, in their haste, had failed to depress their barrels low enough. It was a fatal, 1-second mistake, her own cannon answered. With her finger clamped down on the trigger, she unleashed the full, unholy fury of the GAU-8 Avenger. It wasn't a burst. It was a continuous, 3-second roar of pure destruction. A river of depleted uranium shells, each the size of a milk bottle, smashed into the granite rock shelf just below the green laser dot. The impact didn't just chip the rock, it shattered it. The massive granite overhang, weakened by 1 billion years of erosion and now pulverized by her cannon fire, collapsed. Tons of rock and debris rained down, burying the Tunguska in an avalanche of its own protection. A secondary explosion, deep within the rubble, sent a plume of black smoke billowing into the sky. The monster was dead silence. A profound, ringing silence fell over the valley, broken only by the whine of her one remaining engine and the thunderous beat of the Chinook rotors overhead. The fighters on the ridges had stopped firing, their morale shattered by the impossible spectacle they had just witnessed. They began to fade back into the rocks, their will to fight extinguished. "LZ is clear," Ava transmitted, her voice a strained, exhausted croak. "I say again, LZ is clear. You are clear to land." The lead Chinook touched down, its ramp dropping before the skids had even settled. The members of Trident Team, battered and bruised but alive, sprinted from their cover and piled into the belly of the bird. Within 30 seconds, they were airborne again, rising out of the canyon of ghosts they had almost called their tomb. As the second Chinook lifted off, Trident Actual's voice came over the radio, filled with a raw, profound emotion that transcended military protocol. "Valkyrie, I don't know what to say. You are the damn storm." Ava watched them go, a silent guardian angel hovering over their retreat. Only when the helicopters were clear of the canyon's mouth did she allow herself to think about her own survival. The adrenaline was fading, and a crushing exhaustion was taking its place. The plane was barely holding together. The manual controls were a constant, brutal fight. Every dial on her panel was in the red. She was losing fuel, losing hydraulic pressure, losing altitude. The flight back to base was a blurry, nightmarish ordeal. She didn't fly. She wrestled the crippled jet across the sky, coaxing it, threatening it, begging it to hold together for just a few more miles. She lost all comms again. She was alone in the dark, a falling star trying to outrace gravity. By the time the lights of the airfield appeared on the horizon, she wasn't sure if they were real or a hallucination. She didn't have enough control for a proper landing approach. She had no flaps, no air brakes, and her landing gear refused to deploy. This wouldn't be a landing. It would be a controlled crash. She lined up with the emergency runway, a long, lonely strip of asphalt reserved for disasters. Her final prayer was a simple one: just keep the wings level. The Warthog hit the tarmac with a sickening screech of metal on concrete. The belly of the plane scraped along the runway, sending up a massive rooster tail of sparks that lit up the night. The aircraft veered violently to the left, towards a row of empty fuel tankers. With the last of her strength, she stomped on the right rudder pedal, forcing the plane back onto the strip. It skidded for what felt like a mile, shedding pieces of its airframe along the way, before finally, mercifully, grinding to a halt in a cloud of smoke and leaking fluid. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing, and the ticking of cooling metal. Then, the canopy hissed open. She unstrapped herself, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and residual adrenaline. She climbed down the ladder, her boots hitting the ground with a thud. She had made it, and then she saw them. The entire base, it seemed, was there. Lined up along the edge of the runway, bathed in the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles, were hundreds of people. Pilots, mechanics, medics, even cooks from the mess hall. They stood in dead silence, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and disbelief, looking at the mangled wreckage of a plane and the lone figure standing beside Aitira. As she began to walk towards them, a path cleared. No one spoke. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel. Then, from the crowd, a group of men emerged. It was Trident Team. They had landed just minutes before her. Their faces were covered in grime and sweat, but their eyes were clear. Their leader, Trident Actual, stepped forward. He stood in front of her for a moment, then slowly, Deliberately, he raised his hand to his brow in a sharp salute. One by one, the other 11 members of his team did the same. It was a salute of ultimate respect, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. It said thank you. It said you are one of us. It said we are alive because of you. A single tear traced a path through the dirt on Ava's cheek. The silence was finally broken by a slow, rhythmic clap. It came from Sarge, her crew chief, who stood nearby, his face beaming with fierce pride. Another person joined in, then another, until the entire flight line erupted in a thunderous, sustained ovation. It was a sound of gratitude, of celebration, of pure, unadulterated respect for the woman who had flown into the mouth of hell and come back with 12 souls in her pocket. Through the crowd, a figure pushed his way to the front. It was Colonel Thorne. His face was pale, his uniform immaculate as always, but his eyes told a different story. They were wide, stunned, the arrogance and condescension completely stripped away, replaced by something Ava had never seen in him before: humility. He walked up to her, the applause slowly dying down as everyone waited to see what he would do. He stood before her, the commander and the subordinate who had defied him. He opened his mouth, as if to yell, to reprimand, to read her the riot act. But no words came out. He looked at her, then at the wreckage of her plane, then at the faces of the men she had saved. He swallowed hard. The regulations, the protocols, the rulebook, they all seemed so small, so meaningless in the face of what she had done. He didn't speak. He simply looked her in the eye, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, turned on his heel, and walked away. That nod was a victory. It was more satisfying than any medal, more validating than any promotion. It was a silent admission that he had been wrong, that they had all been wrong. They had seen a wall. She had become the storm that knocked it down. She turned her gaze back to the battered, broken, beautiful machine that had carried her through the fire. It was more than an aircraft. It was a testament, a monument to the idea that sometimes the most impossible things are only impossible until someone is brave enough to do them.